So in 2024, I was pretty stirred in my spirit to start connecting with more, like-minded believers throughout New Zealand, throughout the country. And in fact, that actually led me to connecting with some people outside of New Zealand as well. And, I had the opportunity, because I started connecting with a lot of people, I had the opportunity to share my testimony on Sean Finnegan's podcast, Restitutio. And so this was back in June 2024. That's me, that's Sean. And, when I shared my testimony, it went, it was public, but I didn't know who was going to hear it. I didn't know who was going to listen and go, oh yeah, that's speaking to me. I had no idea who was out there. But as a result of sharing my testimony, a number of people heard it and subsequently then decided to come along to the conference that we held in November in 2024, which is where we met for the first time. And because people turned up to that conference, we realized there was a number of us locally that we, nearby. And so we decided, hey, we should start meeting together. And so we started meeting together a little bit. And as a result of that, Living Hope Christian Church formed. And so then, also from sharing my testimony, Sean Finnegan decided he was going to come over to New Zealand for the conference to meet, me and the others around here. And they decided that they were really keen to support what we were doing and to give us, the aid to kickstart the church, right? And so at the start of 2025, the resources were there, the people were there, and Living Hope started. And I kind of look back and go, one of the biggest turning points was me sharing my testimony with others. And so, this is something that we're going to be talking about today. Our testimony can be a really powerful tool when we are sharing with others. When others hear our story and they hear our journey, it can have a great impact on them. It can encourage them, challenge them, equip them, inspire them in a number of ways, both to come to faith, but also within their own faith journey. I remember hearing Michael Boleski's testimony a number of weeks back, and it was a great encouragement, to me. And so our journey, what God has done in our lives, might be the very thing that someone needs to hear, right? And we all have a unique and special testimony, and we shouldn't be ashamed of it. But hopefully by the end of today, we'll be encouraged to think more deeply about our own testimony, maybe even write it out or spend some time thinking about that, and hopefully be encouraged to share it with some other people when you get the chance. So we're going to be turning to Acts chapter 22 today. That's where we're going to be focusing most of our time. And we're going to be looking at how Paul shared his testimony. And hopefully he'll give us a bit of a template to follow when we're thinking about our own. And he might give us some indication of how we might think about how God has shaped our life and what he's been doing in our lives. So if you want to turn there, you can, but we're going to be sort of firstly going through a little bit of context just to help us understand what was going on. So I need to use my laser pointer. Do you guys see that place here called Ephesus? Okay. So our story today starts with Paul in Ephesus. Now, Paul had been in Ephesus for 2 and a bit years. Okay. He had been, doing his missionary work. He had already traveled from Antioch all the way to Ephesus, and then he spent about 2 and a bit years there doing his different mission work. And in Acts chapter 19, verse 21, it says, "Now after these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia," I don't even know how to say that, "and go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome." Okay, so this verse, chapter 19, verse 21, starts off the final movement of the whole book of Acts, right? The final part of the book where Paul's going to bring the gospel to Rome. And I want you to remember this part, that Paul was stirred in his spirit to firstly go to Jerusalem, but also to Rome. Okay, I want you to keep that in the back of your mind as we move forward today. But what happens subsequently from Paul having this desire is that he travels through Macedonia, which is up here. He travels to Philippi, Thessalonica, and Berea, and he comes into Greece, into Athens, and he spends a little bit of time there. And he does his thing, and then pretty quickly he moves back. You follow the blue line back home, basically. He follows it back around. And then he comes to this place called Miletus. And he spends a little bit of time there. He calls the Jewish elders from Ephesus back to him, and he tells them that he's going to be not seeing them ever again. He's going to be heading home to Jerusalem, and he's going to be probably arrested and all of these things. And in fact, along the way on his journey, he gets to, Tyre, and he has these, there's a prophet there, and I can't remember his name, but the prophet basically tells him, if you go to Jerusalem, dude, you're going to get arrested, and you're going to get persecuted pretty heavily, so don't go. And Paul's like, no, I'm going anyway, because that's what the Lord has told me that I should be doing. Right? So Paul's going to Jerusalem in his mind, knowing that bad stuff's going to happen to me. Yeah? But he decides to go anyway. And so he travels all the way down, and slowly, with some other disciples, they make their way to Jerusalem. This is just an AI-generated picture of possibly what Jerusalem would have looked like back then. Okay, with the big temple and the stone buildings. So they come to Jerusalem, and Paul visits James and some of the other disciples, because James was the early church was based in Jerusalem, and there was a lot of disciples or Christians in Jerusalem still. So he meets with them and tells them about all of the things that God had done, through the Gentiles, and they celebrate and they praise God because of it. And then Paul, with 4 of the others, they have to go through this time of cleansing. So they have to shave their heads, and they have to go to the temple and probably do some offerings and a whole bunch of things that I don't really need to get into. But essentially they had this time of cleansing which lasted 7 days. And we read, during this 7 days of cleansing, some pretty interesting stuff. From verse 27, it says, when the 7 days were almost completed, the Jews from Asia, seeing him, that's Paul, in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, men of Israel, help! This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against the people and the law and this place. Moreover, he even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place. For they had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, with him in the city, and they supposed that Paul had brought him into the temple. Then all the city was stirred up, and the people ran together. They seized Paul, dragged him out into the temple, and at once the gates were shut. So what happens next is that the soldiers, the Paul's being dragged out, seized by the Jews, and the news of this comes to the tribune. Now, a tribune is like another title for a Roman soldier who's in command of about 1,000 other Roman soldiers. So he's quite a high up person. He gets wind of this, and these soldiers all rush to see what's going on. There's a big commotion going on outside the temple. And so they come, and when they get there, the Jews stop beating Paul. And, it's nice for Paul. and then he gets arrested. But Paul, it's so loud, the noise is so crazy that the soldiers couldn't understand what Paul was saying. Paul was trying to tell them what was going on, but they couldn't hear him. So they lead him away to the barracks, to put him in prison essentially, and then question him. And they assumed that he was this Egyptian man as well. For some reason, the soldiers believed he was this Egyptian man who'd been stirring up a revolt with a bunch of assassins out in the wilderness. And you can read a little bit about that there. We won't go too much, but that's in Acts chapter 21. And Paul's being dragged away, and he kind of pauses and he asks them. He's allowed to speak, and he says to them, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no obscure city. I beg you, permit me to speak to the people." And when he had given him permission, Paul, standing on the steps, motioned with his hand to the people. And when there was a great hush, he addressed them in the Hebrew language, saying, now I want to pause here. So, Paul's been beaten. He's finally gotten a word out. I missed the point, but he actually speaks in Greek to these soldiers. And the soldiers go, man, if you're an Egyptian dude, you wouldn't be speaking Greek right now. And so they go, oh, maybe this guy isn't the right one. We've got the wrong guy. So they let him speak. And then he stands up to speak to the crowd, and he changes his language again. And instead of speaking Greek, he speaks in the Hebrew language. And so now we've come to the point where Paul is able to share his testimony. He's going to share who he is and what he's actually doing here and what it's all about. There's been a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of judgment going on up until this point. But remember that this crowd's hostile, and remember that these people, want to hurt him. So we're going to turn now to Paul's testimony, and we're going to hear what he has to say to this Jewish crowd, and how he's going to address them. So this is from the start of Acts chapter 22. So if you have your Bible and you want to turn there, you can turn there now. So let's get started. This is what Paul says. Brothers and fathers, hear the defense that I make before you. And when they heard he was addressing them in the Hebrew language, they became even more quiet. And he said, I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, as all of you are this day. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering to prison both men and women. Sorry. Here we go. Persecuted, binding and delivering to prison both men and women, as the high priest and the whole council of elders can bear witness. From me, I received letters to the brothers and journeyed towards Damascus to take those also who were there and bring them in bonds to Jerusalem to be punished. I want to pause here for a second. The first part of Paul's testimony is his life before Jesus. Right? He begins with his, before he ever met Jesus, he describes his passion for the Jewish faith, his rigorous education in the law, his life in Jerusalem, and ultimately his hatred towards the way, referring to the Christian faith. Right? This was the greatest way that he could express how zealous he was for God, by describing the persecution that he put people to death and imprisoned people for going against, his Hebrew heritage. And I think this is a really interesting thing for us to think about. When we're sharing our testimony, it's really a great idea to share our life before Jesus. For many people, that might be difficult. There could be trauma there, pain, shame, guilt, because when we think back, sometimes the stuff we did before we were a Christian, it's not super godly, it might not be super amazing to think about, and there might be pain there. But when we look at Paul, I don't think you could, there's not too many people that would be on the same level of the things that Paul was doing. He was murdering people, right? He was doing some pretty full-on stuff, and in the name of God too. And yet he's not ashamed to share that that's who he was, right? When we can share with people truly where we've come from, I think this can be a really awesome step in sharing our testimony, because people they can relate to that. That's where, they can go, okay, you were there, well, that's where I am now, and they can connect with you, right? And so sharing our life before Christ can be a really powerful tool to connect with people and to help make them think what's coming next is relevant for them. Yeah? And so, we don't need to be proud of our past. We don't need to, be pushing it out there as if it's great, but I don't think we should also be shying away from sharing it. And I think it can be really powerful when we do it well. So let's carry on. What's our next part? Let's carry on reading from verse 6. As I was on my way and drew near to Damascus, about noon, a great light from heaven suddenly shone around me. And I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And I answered, Who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. And I said, What should I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, Rise and go to Damascus, and there you will be told all that is appointed for you to do. So our second part, following our description of Paul's life before Christ, he then moves to his encountering Jesus, right? He describes how Jesus, met him on the road, how he was confronted, and he could no longer deny that Jesus really was the risen Lord. He had met him face to face. And so I think this is another really cool model for us to follow. We share our life before Christ, and then we share how we encountered. What was the moment that you realized this is true? Now, I just want to step in here and say sometimes this is about our conversion to Christianity, but there are times in my own faith journey as a Christian where I've had a moment where I've encountered Christ and I've gone, man, I got that wrong, and I've needed to change my belief or practice or whatever that is. And so this could be for a great number of things. But I think this is another really important part, because our encounter with Jesus, the thing that sparked it for us, or the thing that Jesus put on our heart, might be the same thing for someone else that brings them to realize that Jesus is Lord, or to realize this new truth or this new thing. And so for us, when we can share, what was it that made you go, I might have this wrong, or what made you think, okay, no, Jesus, actually, I think you are Lord. If you have that moment in your life, that's awesome. And hopefully we can look back on our lives and kind of see maybe that time. Let's carry on. Point 3. Oh dear. Come back to me, words. There we are. It's from verse 11. And since I could not see because of the brightness of that light, I was led by the hand by those who were with me and came to Damascus. And one Ananias, a devout man according to the law, well spoken of by all the Jews who lived there, came to me and standing by me said to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight, and at appointed time you will know his will. When have I... Oh no, verse 14, sorry. I don't know when my slides have changed. You will say, and at that very hour I received my sight and saw him. And he said, the God of our fathers has appointed you to know his will, to see the righteous one, and to hear a voice from his mouth. For you will be a witness for him to everyone of what you have seen and heard. And now why do you wait? Rise and be baptized and wash away your sins. So this next part, after his encountering Christ, he then describes how he has been changed by Christ. Now, I've always wondered, this blinding of Paul is this symbolic of the inward transformation that's going on within him, right? He was blinded, and then he comes to this place, and he's given a new purpose. His eyes are opened, he can see again, and he is changed, right? This blinding, this receiving new sight is sort of symbolic of the inward transformation that's going on within Paul. And I think this part of a testimony is possibly one of the most powerful parts, right? The change that goes within. And I think when we're sharing a testimony, just like Paul, being able to share how it was that you were changed, this can be super, and powerful for people to hear. Because that person's stuck back here, stuck in the sin, whatever it is, addiction or trauma or pain or whatever, when they see that you were there, that you encountered Jesus and that you have been changed, their mind goes, that is something that I might be able to experience one day. And I think all of us have gone through different experiences, and this is why it's so beautiful for us all to know our testimonies and share it, because we were all in different places and we've all been changed in slightly different ways. And so for people to see that, they're gonna have hope that they too might be able to change, right? And now your change might not be as sudden as Paul's. I know for me, my faith journey took a lot longer. I think I had my Christ moment when I was about 8 or 9, when I was at Finlay Park, and I from that moment on, I've never denied that Jesus was Lord and that God existed and that I wanted to know them. However, how that affected and changed my life took a lot longer than one day being blinded and then getting prayed for and then boom, I'm fully off. It took me probably until I was mid to late teens before that really became a reality for me in my obedience and repentance. And so all of us are going to have a slightly different story. We're all going to have a slightly different timeline. But the point is still the same. There should be change, right? There should be point A before Christ. There should be point C after, there being the change of now you know Christ and you've been changed by him. And so I think it's really cool for us to identify, how have we been changed? If you look back at your life, how have you grown? How have you changed? And being able to share that with people, man, that can be really, really encouraging. I want that. I want to be changed like you. Because, man, I look at Paul's testimony here and I go, man, I wish I could experience that. I wish I could have my eyes opened to the truth and these things and see Jesus. So, I want to encourage you guys to think about how you've been changed by Christ. And so our final part then of Paul's testimony reads this. When I had returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw him saying to me, make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, because they will not accept your testimony about me. And I said, Lord, they themselves know that in one synagogue after another I imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him. And he said to me, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. And so, sorry, I did it again. I'm so bad at that. The final part of his testimony is his continued living for Jesus. Right? He talks about this deep relationship that he has. You know, the first thing he says, I went to Jerusalem and I was praying in the temple. This theme of praying comes up again, right? And he fell into a trance. And this is when he's talking about this deep connected relationship that he now has with Jesus and with God, right? And he's talking to them and he's listening to them and he's being led by them. So he's talking about this this life that he's now entered into, that he's continuing to walk, and that he's going to go wherever they tell him to. And I think this is a really, really important part of a testimony, but one that can also be overlooked. I'll bring the whole thing up for you. You know, we've talked about the really exciting stuff. We've talked about the dramatic life before Jesus, the change, the emotion, how our new life looks. And often that can be where it finishes. But I think this is such an important part of a testimony to describe to people that it doesn't just stop there. It doesn't just stop at when you've been changed. It's an an ongoing relationship with Jesus and with God. And I think a lot of people, when we share our testimony, they forget that, and a lot of people kind of get this sense that, being a Christian, it's like that one-time emotional, feel real good, great. And actually what Paul describes here is suffering, right? In those verses, if I just quickly go back, he talks about they're not going to accept your testimony about me. You need to get out of there. It's not going to be good for you in Jerusalem. So Paul's, his testimony is about how he's continually following Jesus, but also about how following Jesus is not going to be an easy life, and about how it's going to bring trials and hardship, but we are to listen and follow him no matter what. Sorry, my clicker is not clicking. Let me leave it there for a minute. And so Paul's testimony gives us a really good structure to follow when we're thinking about our own, right? We've got his life before Christ, his encountering of Jesus, the way he was changed by Christ, and then his life that comes after knowing Jesus. Now, as a result of Paul sharing his testimony, this beautifully structured, telling, everyone who heard repented, were baptized. Paul was welcomed into Jerusalem as a hero. Not quite. That's what we want. That's what we would want the story to say. Paul was arrested by the Roman soldiers, and he was taken away to be beaten. And the crowd that were listening there became even more angry after he shared his testimony than before he had even opened his mouth. It kind of draws that picture, right? And so Paul is being dragged away by the soldiers, and he's about to kind of be put into the barracks, put into prison. In fact, I think they were literally getting the whips out to beat him. And Paul asks them the question. He says, is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman citizen? Now, up until this point, Paul has never played the Roman citizen card yet, right? He's never played, that little card that will get him out of some punishment. Yeah. And so essentially the Roman soldiers are like, what? Are you a Roman citizen? And he goes, yep. And they withdraw from him. They pull away and they don't beat him, because they know that it is wrong to beat anyone who's a Roman citizen especially if they are unconvicted of a crime at that point, which he was. And so what unfolds over the next 5 chapters of the book of Acts is Paul's winding, long, treacherous road, meeting kings and officials, government officials, sharing with people, but it leads him all the way to Rome. Now, remember right back at the start of our message, Paul's heart and his stirring within his spirit was to go to Jerusalem and then to Rome. Now, I don't know, but I don't think he thought it was going to be quite like that. I think he might have thought he was going to go to Rome on his own accord, maybe stroll up there and see some people. But this was the plan that God had for him, was to go in chains. And I think this is a really interesting thing. When we share our testimony, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how it's going to land with people. We don't know how people are going to react, right? Some people might get arrested. Hopefully not, Vaughan. I look at you because you're the most likely candidate there. Sharing your, with your street preaching. Hopefully, our world doesn't turn to that and we have the freedom to continue to speak boldly. For other people like me, when you share your testimony, it might end up that you connect with dozens of other people who are like-minded and build friendships in a community that you never thought you were going to have. Right? Like sharing our testimony, we don't know where it's going to lead us and how God's going to use that to further his plans. But that doesn't mean we should stop sharing our stories with other people. I think people can be powerfully impacted when we take that step of courage and share what we've been through and how God has changed us in our life. Now, how are we doing for time? I probably should sit down. I'll try and be real quick. I've got one final thing that I have, as I was writing this, it's something I reflected on and for me was a really cool part of this whole story. Earlier this year, Kayla and I were over in Australia for the UCA conference. Michael and Cheryl were there. I think you guys are over there on the left there. Kayla and I are here. I was squinting. It was bright, that photo. I remember it was terrible. And it wasn't so much at the conference, but it was what happened after the conference. So we were after the conference. This was in about an hour south of Sydney. So after our conference, we had to catch trains back to Sydney to stay near the airport so we could catch our flights the next morning. And so me and Kayla were sitting next to a couple of our friends, Cassie and Joel, for those of you who know Cassie and Joel. And we were sitting there having a conversation, and the conversation was about how we had been mistreated by the leadership of our previous church. How we had been essentially, there was no contact when they asked us to leave. They didn't want to hear any of our thoughts or reasoning. They didn't want to have any conversations around anything. They just asked us to leave. There was no contact afterwards. There was a very, very bad exit strategy on their part. And so we were sharing about these things and just how the leadership team had mistreated us. And sitting in the seats behind us was Michael and Cheryl and Jeremy. And Michael pipes up. He must have been listening, as he does. Good. And he said something that has stuck with me. He said, God let you go through that and allowed you to feel that way so that you would know exactly what not to do in your church. Right. I think Michael's totally right. Those experiences that we went through helped me become the person that I am and helped me become the person that God could use to help plant a church and to then do it in a healthier way, right? And my experience, the pain I went through, the suffering I went through made me into the person that I am. And reading these chapters in Acts made me reflect on that even more so. And if we quickly just look at Paul, right? Paul had some things that made him the perfect person to be the one to share his testimony at that time so that it would achieve the things that God wanted it to achieve. Firstly, his impeccable Jewish heritage, right? The fact that he was born in the city in Tarsus, but that he grew up in Jerusalem under one of the most renowned teachers of his day, Gamaliel, right? Like, he was a Pharisee, and the people that he was talking to there could not deny it. In fact, I'm sure many of those people there would have known who he was. Secondly, the knowledge of multiple languages, the fact that he could speak Greek and Hebrew made him perfect. I think if he couldn't have spoken Greek, he probably would have just been taken to prison and they would have assumed he was the Egyptian dude that was causing the revolt. But because he stood up and spoke Greek, right, they were like, no, okay, yeah, we'll let you share. Then he changes to Hebrew and he speaks in Hebrew and the crowd goes even quieter because they're like, dude, this guy, he speaks our language. Now, he's probably speaking Aramaic. I should probably put that out there. It was a Hebrew dialect, which is very likely Aramaic at that time. So when I say Hebrew, I should say Aramaic, right? Secondly, his history of persecution. He was a zealous Jew who persecuted anyone who came against the Christian faith, right? And so for him, now being a witness for the Christians, man, what a powerful statement that would be, you know? And, you know, it was always going to cause a stir within the people. And then finally, him being a Roman citizen. When you add them all up, it makes Paul to be the perfect person to share his testimony and be the one who would take the gospel to Rome. Right? Like, God could see, it's as if God was like, boom, that's my man. That's the guy that I'm going to use. He's the tool that I can use to achieve my purposes. And here's the thing. You guys are all a bunch of tools as well. I thought that was quite good when I thought about it. That's the only reason I wanted to do this part. Right, each one of us is unique, and we've all been shaped and molded into the people that we are now. And God knew how to use Paul then, and he knows how he can use us now. We need to trust him to do that. There might be something that God is stirring within you to do. There might be something that God is stirring within you saying, okay, I want you to take a step of faith. I want you to maybe do this thing or do this thing. And the question in your mind might be going, am I the right person for that job? Am I the right person to be doing that? And I think you should be trusting God that he knows you better than you even know yourself. He knows your strengths. He knows your weaknesses. He knows the things that you think you're good at, but you're not. And he knows the things that you're not good at, that you don't even know that you are good at, that you don't even know you're good at yet because you haven't tried them. And so I want to encourage all of you here today that just as God used Paul back then, he wants to use you now. And he knows who you are. And if he's stirring something within you, it's because he knows you can do it. He knows you can handle it. And he's got something for you to trust him with and to step out. And so if that thing is something to do with our church, then come and see us. You know, part of the survey or the thing that we've been talking about is what would you like to be involved with, right? If that can be a conversation that we can have and then help, encourage or push you into those things, then we would love to do that. If it's something totally separate, maybe God's putting on your heart to connect with someone or an old friend or a new friend. Maybe it's to take a new job or to move or to do any number of things God might be putting on your heart. Then pray about it, think about it, but be confident that God will be there for you and that God knows who you are, and he wouldn't be calling you out into those things if he didn't think you could handle it. So that's where I want to finish today. And I want us to just be encouraged by Paul and by how God has powerfully used him and the example that he sets for us in our lives.